For a couple weeks now, we've been examining the minor prophets. First of all, we looked at Habakkuk, and it fell into that middle section of God's plan for the nations. And we saw where there's a need for a no matter what kind of faith. And that's applicable to us under the new covenant, especially living in the uncertain times that we live in today. We need a no matter what. I don't care what happens, I'm going to serve God. And we need to have that attitude when it comes to God. We also, the last minor prophet that we examined was Obadiah. And he too fell under God's plan for the nation. That prophecy was against Edom. We know Edom was the descendants of Esau. And we saw there some application for us. They were going to be punished because of their pride. They were going to be punished because of their mistreatment of their brethren. And they were going to inherit the law of sowing and reaping. They were going to see that come to pass for them. And that's a common theme with a lot of the minor prophets, is sowing and reaping. You will reap what you sow, and that's spilled right over into the new covenant in Galatians 6, 7, and 8. So tonight we're going to examine the longest of the minor prophets. So with that being said, you can understand that we will not be able to go into very great detail regarding Hosea, because there's 14 chapters to cover, and I'm going to try to cover them in a one section kind of deal, one night for each visit of the prophets. But Hosea is a little different because he falls into the first category. He falls into the call for repentance with a promise. Both Hosea, Joel, and also Amos fall into that category. So tonight we'll examine Hosea. Hosea, his name means God is salvation. And that's applicable to the lesson that we will have tonight. He was one of three that would prophesy not to the southern kingdom of Judah, but to the northern kingdom of Israel, composing of the 10 tribes other than Judah and Benjamin. And he was the only one, though, out of those three to live there and prophesy where he was living, which can be a dangerous thing. Now, throughout this book, you might see Ephraim mentioned. That's short for Ephraim. But Ephraim was the largest tribe in the northern kingdom, and because of that, Israel is referred to as Ephraim throughout this study. So you might see that, but just understand that entails Israel. Now, he prophesied under the reign of Jeroboam II. And during that time, for Israel, is a time of great prosperity. They had a lot of riches, but the problem was they were rotting from the inside out. They were trusting in their riches. They were getting involved in foreign alliances, trying to find allies among whom should have been their enemies. Instead of trusting in God, they were trying to create numbers. And that was a problem throughout a lot of the Old Testament, trying to have a numerical army. Devotional was brought about that with David and his census, wanting to know how many men he had. So that is a problem. When we get caught up in numbers, we can forget about God. And that's applicable to us again under the new covenant. Now, this book is not broken up in the same way. Just about every commentary will break it up in a little different way. But we're going to break it up into 4 sections, and then we're going to look. This will be a little different than the other lessons that we've had. We're going to look at how Hosea impacts the New Testament, and then we will have some brief application. First of all, as we look at chapters 1 through 3, we see Israel's harlotry. Their harlotry was pictured. Their unfaithfulness to God is pictured. And you see this in what the title of the book could be. It could be entitled Sharing God's Heartache, because Hosea shared God's heart. He had a wife by the name of Gomer. And if we know anything about the book, now some people will say this is an allegory, but it's hard for me. This is a historical narrative. And it's a realistic situation that Hosea went through. But Hosea could be empathetic with what God was going through, because his wife Gomer was running around on him. She was committing adultery to him. And this lady bore him 3 children. And Hosea became a walking lesson of what he was preaching. He was preaching about Israel's adultery to God, while he was living in the messed up home life that he had, where his wife was committing adultery on him. And we will see this played out through these first 3 chapters. Now again, he took a wife named Gomer, and she bore 3 children. Now we know the first child was named Jezreel, a son, in verses 3 through 5 of chapter 1. His name is Jezreel, but the word itself means God scatters. Now a lot of bloodshed was shed in the valley of Jezreel, but this means God scatters. And it would picture a time when God would scatter Israel among the nation. But also this word can mean God sows, because there's always hope for a nation when they will turn back to God. Now, I want to address something real quickly. This is a problem within the religious world when it comes to the prophets. Many times people read the prophets and immediately try to apply it to the United States of America. You cannot do that. You cannot do that, because you will make a huge mistake, because these prophecies are typically, for the most part, to God's people, Israel. The nation of Israel or Judah, but God's people. Now, who is God's nation of people under the new covenant? The church is. So this application needs to be made to God's people under the new covenant, not thrown out to America trying to reach out to make some kind of application that was never meant to be. Now there's some general ways that it can be used, but again, this word Jezreel, I had to throw that. I meant to do that on the front ends. I apologize for that. This word Jezreel means God scatters, but again, there's a hopeful message, because in verses 10 and 11, there is hope for Israel if they will just turn back to God. There's hope for God's people if they will always turn back to God when they wander away. It says in verse 11, "Then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together and appoint for themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel." So there's hope within this word, not just that God will scatter the nations, but God will bring them back if they will turn to Him. And that's a message for us. But we also find in verses 6 and 7 that she bore a daughter named, and I'm going to butcher this up, you're going to have to do your best with this word, Lo Ruhamah. That sound good enough to y'all? Lo Ruhamah. That's a hard word. We don't just throw that word. It doesn't roll off the tongue very well. But if you'll note, it doesn't say with these last two that she bore them to Hosea. So some have pointed out that it's very possible that these last 2 children were actually not Hosea's children. But it doesn't matter. She was committing adultery. But the word Lo Ruhamah means not pitied. And that would refer to a time when God's mercy would be lifted from Israel, and they would be allowed to suffer for the sin that they were committing. So that's a message for us. We don't ever want to forsake the mercy and grace of our God, do we? I would hope we would not. And finally, she bore a son named Lo-Ammi. Lo-Ammi, and that's probably butchered up again in verses 8 and 9. And that would mean, you are not my people. Ooh, that's a scary thought for God to say, you are not my people. Not my people, and that would refer to when Israel was out of fellowship with God. He didn't recognize them as His people. And that's kind of a picture for us, the day of judgment. What's going to happen to those that do not obey the gospel and are not faithful to God? Depart from me, for I never knew you. So there's a message for us today under the new covenant there. But we find in chapter 2, verses 22 and 23, that God's desire to restore them back into fellowship. And we see that in these verses. Listen to verses 22 and 23. The earth shall answer with grain, with new wine, and with oil. They shall answer Jezreel. There it is. God scatters, but also God sows. Then I will sow her for myself in the earth, and I will have mercy on her who have not obtained mercy. Then I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people. And they shall say, You are my God. Now that's a beautiful picture of God's restoration. God's desire to restore His people back to Him, even though they have forsaken fellowship. If they will just come back, He will take them back. And that's a beautiful picture. Now, Hosea in chapter 3, I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. It's only a 5-verse chapter. But in chapter 3, Hosea is told, this is a picture of him going and finding Gomer. And he goes and finds Gomer, and she's about to be sold into slavery. And he is told to buy her back. Buy her back. And you can again envision what this represents, not only to Hosea, but what it should represent to the people. But I'm going to read it. Then the Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover, and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and 1.5 homers of barley. And I said to her, you shall stay with me many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So too will I be toward you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and His goodness in the latter days. So that is a beautiful picture of not only Hosea buying back his love that has committed adultery against him, but the picture of God willing to buy His people back from spiritual adultery that they were engaged in. Now, God was in a covenant relationship with Israel. They committed spiritual adultery, and God invited them back. That's the picture we see in the first 3 chapters of the book of Hosea. But let's focus on chapters 4 through 7, where God proclaims Israel's sins to them. He proclaims Israel's sin to them. And you find in verse 1 a legal term where the Lord brings a charge against them. Against Israel, the Lord brings a charge. And this envisions a court where Hosea brings them into court and they are found guilty before the Lord. So we see that. And the sins are proclaimed against them. In verse 2, the sins of inhumanity by swearing, lying, killing, stealing, committing adultery. They break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. So inhumanity. Sound familiar? Sounds like America, doesn't it? A lot of what goes on in America. Then, what the book is probably most famous for is verse 6 of Hosea chapter 4. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And here is the sins of the unholy priests and their ignorance of God's law. That is the primary problem in verses 6 through 10. They were ignorant of God's will for them. God's will is given to them to give to the people so that they can know God better. That's what God desires. He desires a relationship. What happens with your relationship as you grow and you get to know someone better and better? That relationship grows, right? Sometimes you find out some things you might not like, and you have to work through those things too. But a relationship grows with knowledge, and that was the problem. Now, someone might say right offhand, oh, well, that means the elders and the preachers would be at fault under the new covenant. No. Who are priests under the new covenant? Everybody that's a Christian is a priest under the new covenant. So it behooves us to think about knowing God's will for us. Therefore, we can grow in our relationship with God. Because who is our high priest today? Jesus Christ, our high priest today. Then in verses 11 through 19 of Hosea chapter 4, you find the sins of idolatry. The sins of idolatry, where they had committed spiritual Baals and other Canaanite gods for the fertility of man, animal, and land. Now, what does that entail? Well, that entails some things we probably don't want to hear. Number one, it entails fornication in their worship to the Baals, because if man is going to be fertile, there you go. If you're going to have fertile animals, what does that entail? Probably something we don't want to hear. In their worship, they committed bestiality. And that's a sickening thing to think about, that they actually engaged in. And then, for the land, they would worship the Baals and the goddess Asherah. And these were problems that the children of Israel were engaged in, major issues that they were engaged in inhumanity, ignorance, and idolatry. So they were engaged in all of these things. But then in chapter 6, we're going to skip over to chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. You see Hosea including himself among the nation, and he is pleading with them, let us go back. Now, sometimes you hear preachers that only preach at you. What does that make you feel like when people only preach at you? They don't include themselves in the message. See, for me, it's almost a turnoff sometimes, because we're all guilty at times. So even preachers need to include themselves in the message at times, many times. And here Hosea is engaging in that. Now, did he preach at the people? Sure. They were guilty. He brought them into court. But he also takes time to say, let me include myself in this. And to this beautiful passage in chapter 6, 1 through 3. Come and let us return to the Lord, for He has torn, but He will heal us. He is stricken, but He will bind us up. After 2 days He will revive us, and on the third day He will raise us up, that we may live in His sight. Let us know. Let us pursue the knowledge of God. There it is, the knowledge of the Lord. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain to the earth. So Hosea is pleading with his people, not at them, he's pleading with them. Let us go back to God. Let us go back to Him. And He will for us. He will bind up our wounds, and to do the same thing away from Him. And that's a beautiful picture. Now, this section and throughout the book, but I picked out this section, Hosea uses word pictures to describe Israel and describe what they were doing to God. In chapter 4 and verse 16, Bill, I couldn't help but think of you. He used the picture, because I've heard you use this word before, of a stubborn heifer. A stubborn heifer, a stubborn calf. The King James, I know the New King James uses the stubborn calf, but many other versions use stubborn heifer. If you've ever dealt with a cow and you're trying to get them to go somewhere they don't want to go, you know exactly what it's like. You may not have grown up on a farm, so you won't have a clue, but there was a man on the plantation where I worked. He was a very religious man until they drove cattle on horseback up there. And we had about 750 head of Black Angus cattle. And they would drive those cows in, and boy, when it come cattle driving time, you would hear him utter words you wouldn't ever heard him say any other time. But he was angry. He was fed up with these stubborn heifers because they would refuse to be directed by God. That's point that Israel would refuse. Then he uses in chapter 6 and verse 4 the morning cloud, the early dew. And what that was envisioning was Israel's loyalty to God. It was like the morning dew. It was like it was like a morning cloud or like the early dew. You've seen fog. By about 10 o'clock, typically it's burn up. The sun's come up and it's gone. The dew gets washed off gets dried off unless you're down here. Sometimes it don't seem like, especially if you're mowing grass, it don't seem like the dew ever goes away when you're cutting grass and that humidity's coming up around you. But anyway, the point was their loyalty to God was very temporary. They were come and go in their loyalty to God. And it's seen in how they treated God. Then in chapter 7 and verse 8, you find the picture of a cake unturned or a cake half-baked. It was baked on one side. You ever had that happen? I haven't, because I don't do cakes. Now, I did one cake that I'll never forget from my mama. She said, son, you just make whatever you want, and then we're going to make a real pound cake. And I put ketchup and mustard and everything you could think of in that cake. She let me make it just like I wanted to. And that, woo, you can't imagine how nasty that was. And it didn't cook very well either. I'll just say that. But here we have a cake half turned, half baked was a picture of how they mixed with the nations. Their religion was only surface deep, if you will. It had no root to it. And they would mix with other people, and it became that their people were deluded. And that's probably why once Israel goes into Assyrian captivity, you really never hear from them again. It's all over. But then you find in chapter 7, verse 11, a silly dove. A silly dove. Now, for you dove hunters, you know that doves are one of the most challenging birds to shoot, especially after they've been shot at a little bit. I see Jay smiling over there. But after he's probably smiling at how I shoot at doves and miss a lot. And David Franklin does too. But anyway, doves, after they've been shot, they'll come rolling and choo, choo, choo. But the picture here is how the dove would flit back and forth. They would flit back and forth because they would go from one political ally to another. They couldn't make up their mind, and they got themselves in big trouble because they didn't trust God. And they were called a silly dove, how they flitted back and forth. And then in chapter 7 and verse 16, you find the deceitful or the treacherous bow. The treacherous bow there in the end of that chapter. They are like a treacherous bow. Now, how does a bow become treacherous? It becomes treacherous when it's pointed back at you. And if you know some of their bows, they would put their feet and pull back and let it go. Well, the picture here is holding the bow and pulling the string, but the arrow is pointed right back and they let go, they're dead. And that's the picture, is that they were going to, again, just like before with Obadiah's prophecy, they would reap what they sowed. They would reap what they sowed. So that's God's proclaiming Israel's sin before them and using these word pictures to do that. And there's many more than that within this wonderful book of God. And now in chapters 8 through 10, we find where God's judgment on Israel is pronounced. His judgment on Israel is pronounced. I'm going to pick up the pace just a little bit. But he could see Assyria coming. It's like Hosea could see them coming, and he again used word pictures in chapter 8 and verse 1, the coming of an eagle. And if you've ever seen, I haven't really seen eagles do it, but hawks, when they zone in on their target, it's about over. I don't care if it's a snake or if it's a rat or a rabbit. When they zone in, they usually get what they're after, and they're very swift to come in and do so. And that's the picture there. In 8 and verse 7, you find the wrath of the whirlwind. That was how Assyria was pictured. And we see that devastation of a tornado. It clears a path when it touches down. And that's the picture here. And you've probably heard this. They've used this in movies. I heard it used in a Western. They sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. And that's the picture here, that tornado would come and destroy. And then in chapter 8, in verse 14, it says, "For Israel has forgotten his Maker and has built temples. Judah also has multiplied fortified cities, but I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour his palaces." So Syria coming is pictured as the burning of a fire, how it will come in and it will just consume. And we know how James envisions the danger of the tongue, that it's set on fire by hell. But to them now, in chapter 8, verses 8 through 9, they were just like the pagans to God. They were like a wild donkey. And I don't know if you've dealt with donkeys, but they're just about like a heifer sometimes when they get their mind made up. In chapter 9 and verse 10, we find that they were like grapes in the wilderness. They were an abomination to God. And they would suffer sorrow in captivity because of that. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. They would pay the penalty of breaking the covenant vow of God. Chapter 9, verses 10 through 11. And they would reap more than they had sown in the first place. And I'm going to tell you, we think about the law of sowing and reaping. If we sow to the flesh, and if we of the flesh reap corruption, we're talking about eternal death. And that's always going to be worse than anything that happens in this life. And that's found in chapter 10, verses 12 through 15. Now, as we get ready to wrap up, we find in this fourth section here in chapters 11 through 14, God's promise of restoration to Israel. The promise of restoration. Now, we looked at earlier how Israel was a wife and how they were unfaithful as a wife to God, but in chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, but in 11, 1 through 7, we find as a son, Israel was ungrateful. You ever dealt with an ungrateful child? I've been an ungrateful child, and I remember how my parents dealt with me, and they dealt rightly with me because I was ungrateful. And I've seen it in my children, I've seen it in other children. It happens, and that's the way they were pictured here. But in chapter 11, in verses 8 and 9, I want to read that because you can almost see God in tears pleading with them to come back to Him. Listen to that. It says, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I set you like Zeboim? My heart churns within me. My sympathy is stirred. I will not execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come with terror." That is a beautiful picture of God's desire for someone unfaithful to come back. Please come back. I do not want you to experience my wrath. God is pleading. And in chapter 12, Hosea continues to communicate God's displeasure, and it spills out not only to the northern kingdom, but all the way in chapters 12, verses 2 through 6, to the southern kingdom. He starts talking to Judah. It had spilled that far. It had gotten that bad. And in chapter 13, verses 5 through 6, we find one of the big-time problems, and it's a big-time problem even in the church today. Israel, in their satisfaction, forgot God. Now that is a big problem in America today, and that's sure enough a big problem for the church in America, is it not? We've got so much that we forget God. And I'm talking about the church. We forget how much we need God, how desperately we need God. Listen to verses 5 and 6 of chapter 13. "I knew you in the wilderness, in the land of great drought. When they had pasture, they were filled. They were filled and their heart was exalted. Therefore, they forgot me." That's God saying, they forgot me. Have we forgotten God? That's something we need to think about. In chapter 14, we find God again promising restoration. But remember, restoration is always contingent on one thing: repentance. Repentance. If they are going to come back to God, they're going to have to turn from their evil ways and turn themselves over to God. But in verses 8 and 9, we find this beautiful picture kind of brought to a conclusion of God's desire for restoration. It says in verse 8 of chapter 14, "Ephraim shall say, 'What have I to do any more with idols? I have heard and observed him. I am like a green cypress tree. Your fruit is found in me. Who is wise? Let him understand these things. Who is prudent? Let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right. The ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them." That statement should echo in our head. The ways of the Lord are right, and they're always right. Now, as we get ready to wrap it up, Hosea in the New Testament. You heard earlier where they said, "Not my people." Well, that might not be a beautiful thing to them, but for us, that is beautiful. Why? Because we were once not a people, but now as Gentiles, we are a people. You find that in Romans 9:25 through 26, and you find it in 1 Peter 2:10. Now, as Gentiles, we can be the people of God. And that's a beautiful picture. That's a beautiful thing that even though we weren't the chosen seed, we can be His people now. In verses 6 and 6, chapter 6 and verse 6, there is a passage, a phrase used by Jesus to rebuke the Pharisees. And why did He rebuke the Pharisees? Because they did not have compassion on sinners. They thought, oh, those people are too sinful. We cannot help them. They're too sinful. There's no one too sinful for God to cure. He is a great physician. Jesus Christ is a great physician. And you find this, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That one should ring in our heads. I desire mercy. We can sacrifice in worship to God, but if we have a hard heart when it comes to sinners, no compassion, God's not going to accept our sacrifices. In chapter 11 and verse 1, and it's echoed into Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15, out of Egypt I have called my son. That's a beautiful picture because that's a picture of Jesus Christ, a picture of the Savior coming in the flesh, the incarnation of God in the flesh, Jesus Christ. And then in chapter 6 and verse 2, we find a beautiful picture where it says, and on the third day, He will raise us up. That is an allusion to what? On the third day, Jesus come out of the tomb. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel, the death, the burial, and the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. Now, we just skimmed the surface of Hosea. I invite you to do a more extensive study of this beautiful book of God. But as we get ready to conclude, remember, God has given us His Word so that we can have a better relationship with Him. Ignorance will not cut it. We cannot be ignorant of God's Word and have a relationship with Him. So it should behoove us, as we talked about this morning, to get in the book and understand that God's ways are always right and make application for our lives. Now, another thing we need to remember quick, it's easy to come to God in the difficult times, isn't it? It's easy to pour out our spirit. Oh, I'm struggling, God. We need to remember Him in the good times as well. Israel did not, and therefore they forgot about Him. Don't forget God in the good times, and don't forget Him in the bad times. Remember God always. And then in Hosea 13 and verse 14 is a beautiful, beautiful passage that comes over to 1 Corinthians 15 verses 54 through 57. And that is where Jesus gives victory over the grave. O grave, where is your victory? There is no victory in the grave, because Jesus has overcome the grave, and because of the gospel, we have hope as well. So as we conclude tonight, if you need to obey the gospel or need the Savior's invitation, you find yourself in the plight that Israel was in, whatever you need, if you just need prayers for strength, whatever you need, we're here for you as together we stand and sing.